Won't call them out by name, but there's someone in this audience who is best friends with my high school English teacher. And I'm pretty sure if they were to communicate that I have bought 5 books, and there are still some coming just on this subject, and I have dedicated myself to learning the structure of how a story is written, she's going to have a heart attack. So this is a miracle in itself. So some information about the book, first off. The actual author of Ruth is unknown. It doesn't tell us who wrote it. There are some scholars who attribute it to Samuel. But when you look at the evidence of the book, there's actually evidence to show that it was either written by or heavily influenced by a woman writer, a gifted storytelling woman, but a woman writer. And that's because of some of the choice of language used, with some feminine gendered pronouns used to describe things that a man would not use. The Hebrew language has very gendered pronouns for things. And so when I would describe something, I would use a different pronoun than, say, a woman would describe the thing. So we can kind of see the differences. So if it wasn't written by a woman, it was definitely heavily influenced by one. But the Samuel writing it is just mere speculation because no one actually knows. Written most likely after the period of Judges, specifically after or during the reign of David. And so we know that it wasn't written during the main section of Judges, and again, due to some linguistics, towards the end of Judges and on through the era of Kings, the Hebrew language was heavily influenced by Aramaic. And so we see that in the original Hebrew. The scholars have broken it down and they can see that Aramaic influence in the writing. But also because of the specific mentioning in David in the genealogical section of this book, David would have had to have existed when it was assembled. And so next, the genealogy is not the main point of this story. Like I've already said, they could have put the genealogy anywhere. And most likely, if it were the most important aspect of this story, it would have been put at the front of the book, not at the end for us to find out later. They would have put it at the front because that's kind of how they highlighted what they were fixing to talk about. Last, we just want to say that whoever wrote it was a gifted storyteller. It was something they excelled at, and they also knew their biblical knowledge. I guess not really biblical because up to that point the whole Bible wasn't written, but the knowledge of their scriptures. And that's because there are some key terms within the book of Ruth that are repeated either 7 or 14 times, which is, if you've studied, and we've kind of went over this in a few lessons, 7 and 14 are kind of the number of completion within the Bible. And so Moab and Moabite are each repeated 7 times within the book. And the word name is repeated 14 times. So we've already talked about the things we're going to kind of consider here. This is how I've broken down the book of Ruth. I've broken into 8 sections, really. I just left off number 8 because it's just the genealogy. But the story itself broken into 7 parts. And there's only 4 chapters, but this is kind of how I've broken it down. Today we're only going to go over part 1. And that's going to be verses 1 through 6. And it's about a family uprooting. We're going to establish characters and establish the tragedy. And that's what happens in this portion of the story. And then as we study further, I'll put together these other sections so that I can present those at later time. So we're going to look at Ruth in consideration of the big picture of the Bible. What is the big picture of the Bible? What's the whole idea of the Bible? If you were to go and ask someone, what is the story that the Bible tells? The answer should be, it's a story of redemption, the redemption of mankind. That's the whole thing, and it can be summed down into those 3 words, story of redemption. Well, the book of Ruth is also a story of redemption, and many other books within the Bible are stories of redemption. And so it's one large redemption story culminated with several smaller redemption stories, smaller tragedies and redemptions that go along with it. And the book of Ruth actually holds multiple levels of redemption within itself. It's not just about one specific redemption. And so we're going to go over, like I said, part 1, a family uproots. And so let's read it. I've put each verse up here individually. And so verse 1, now it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled that there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, went to dwell in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi, and the name of his 2 sons Mahlon and Chilion, Ephrathites of Bethlehem, Judah. And they went to the country of Moab and remained there. Then Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died. She was left with her 2 sons. Now they took wives of the women of Moab. The name of one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth, and they dwelt there about 10 years. Then Mahlon and Chilion also died, so the woman survived her 2 sons and her husband. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law that she might return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the country of Moab that the Lord had visited his people by giving them bread. So those are the only verses we're going to go over. So here's an overview of that. So first off, it was during this story is set during the days of the judges. And that's important because the very last sentence in the book of Judges is, in those days there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. It was not a good place. It was not a good place for the people to be in. They were not spiritually grounded the way they should be. And people were often doing things that counteracted what God wanted them to do. So the family that's living in Bethlehem has been suffering the effects of a famine, and they decide to leave. They travel to Moab, which is, again, another place of lawlessness and open defiance of God. The father, Elimelech, dies. The sons marry Moabite women. They die. And now Naomi decides to return to Bethlehem because she had heard that the famine was over. And so just in these first 6 verses, something kind of popped out to me as I was studying it. We have some names and locations. More specifically, we are given every name of every character introduced to this point. And we are given the names of the locations they came and went to. So what do these names mean? So the Hebrew meaning of Elimelech means, my God is king. Naomi means pleasant, or my pleasant. Mahlon means sick or sickly. And then Chilion means frail or perishing. Orpah means back of the neck. And Ruth means companion or friend. And so, just from what the names mean, we can see that the sons were kind of destined to die. We knew that they were destined to die just from the names given. We see that Naomi is going to be an integral part of this story because she's called pleasant. We see that Elimelech should have been a faithful man of God because his name actually meant, my God is king. And then later on in the other parts, we will find out how Orpah and Ruth's name actually fit with them as well. Some names of locations. Bethlehem means house of bread. And Ephrathite means to be from Bethlehem. And Moab means from the father. So we're given these 2 items so that we can see God's will being performed. And even in a story, which the book of Ruth does not mention God much at all in the grand scheme of things. And so let's look at the story through the eyes of the new names, or the meanings of the names. During a time in Israelite history where there was not a king and everyone did what they wanted, my God is king took his wife Pleasant and his 2 sons, sick and frail, away from the house of bread. Fleeing a famine in their land, most likely being the result of unfaithfulness, they traveled to a place called From the Father, where my God is king dies. His sons take 2 wives from the area they moved to, back of the neck and friend. The sons eventually die there as well. Pleasant was left with back of the neck and friend. They lived together for 10 years. Pleasant decided to travel home to the house of bread as she heard in the land from the Father that the famine had been lifted. And so when you kind of switch those names and put the meanings in there, you kind of get this originally what read as a massive tragedy, And it changes the tone of that story. And so it's not necessary, you're kind of not seeing a tragedy here. More so we're seeing a little bit of consequence for actions. Because Elimelech was supposed to seek God during this famine. He wasn't supposed to leave. He was supposed to seek God. The famine was, in the biblical times, were designed to bring God's people back. Well, instead of bringing him back and making him stronger in his faith with God, he ran away. And that had dire consequences. And so, most likely being a result of, the famine most likely being a result of punishment makes sense because Moab from Bethlehem is only about 60 miles as the crow flies. It's not a lot of distance for a famine to begin and end without specific borders. And so we can see that the famine is most likely only affecting God's land. And so this tells us that Elimelech was punished for running away from what was happening. Now the sons were punished as well. They were of marrying age, which meant they were probably had some influence over their father, and it was a discussion among the three men of the house to move up, uplift, and move. And so they were being punished as well. Well, that left Naomi without a husband. So why was she being punished? Now this is a little bit of conjecture on my part, but there's some biblical evidence for it, a little bit at least. We see many times in the scriptures where wives correct husbands and they are still referred to as great women. Sarah corrected Abraham in Genesis 21. Abigail corrected Nabal in 1 Samuel 25. And Zipporah corrected Moses in the Exodus 4. Yet they were all still referred to as great or good women. And we're never told that Naomi bucked this idea at all. And she should have. She should have looked at her husband and said, no, we're not leaving God's kingdom. So here's a little diagram, if you will, of how they traveled. They started in Bethlehem, went to Moab. That wasn't an easy journey, just going through mountains and valleys and a river. But it was only about 60 miles apart. And here's a little better. Bethlehem's here. Moab's over here. So it wasn't just straight across. There was some travel through mountains involved. And so what's the application for this part of the story for us? Well, faithful men can make bad decisions that have consequences. And we have to live with those consequences or die with those consequences, but the consequences will be had nonetheless. And faithful women should stand for God. They should take a stand if their husband is attempting to make an ungodly decision for the family. So an example of this would be if I wanted to move somewhere for work and there wasn't a church within driving distance that I could go to every Lord's Day. Not only would I hope, but I expect Cassandra would put her foot on my neck and say, no, that's not happening. You can't do that. And I expect her to do that because she's a godly woman and her first priority is to stand up for God. And so why is the locations we're given important? Marriage in the Old Testament came with specific provisions and rights that were granted to the wife when marrying into a family. I know that doesn't have anything to do with location, but it'll tie together. And by marrying Moabite women, the sons made these women eligible for God-given protections, such as the law of inheritance and the ability to have a kinsman redeemer. And so this was a big deal because it was against the law for a Moabite or Ammonite to enter the assembly of God. In Deuteronomy 23, verse 3 says, no Ammonite or Moabite will enter the assembly of the Lord, not even in the 10th generation. And I put those dots there. Those are verses 4 through 5. And the last verse 6 says, thou shalt not seek their peace, nor their prosperity for all thy days forever. So from the surface, it looks like there was a strict law not allowing Moabite women or men, or I guess citizens, within the assembly of God. And so there's a lot of, I guess, argument back and forth between scholars saying, oh, well, God allowed his law to be broken, or this or that. Well, God doesn't allow his laws to be broken. When God says something, God means it. His mind can be changed, but anytime his mind is changed, we're told that it's changed and why it's changed. We're never told this changed. We're never told why. So I started thinking about it a little different. Anytime a punishment was given to anybody in the Old Testament, or almost any time, there was some type of time frame put on it. Wandering in the wilderness for a generation is an example. Well, there's a time frame on this, into the 10th generation. From the time of Exodus to Ruth was about 450 years to the end period of Judges when this should have taken place. And a generation in biblical times was about 40 years. And if you do the math, that puts Ruth in the 11th generation. She was an 11th generation Moabite. This was the completion of a promise, the end of punishment. It wasn't God allowing his word to go against, or people to go against his word. He was fulfilling his promise that Moabite and Ammonites would not be allowed even in the 10th generation, meaning the 11th generation, that punishment was lifted. And so that was allowing the punishment to be over. Now, the Moabites did not receive entrance into God's kingdom free of charge. That doesn't mean that the whole thing just meant you're welcome back as you are right now, let's go. And then the rule for the Israelites lasts forever. So while Moabites and Ammonites would now be allowed back into the assembly of God, the Israelites couldn't seek them out to bring them in. They had to seek it themselves. And how is that much different than where we are today? I can't force you into the church. You have to seek it yourself. I can give you the tools when you start seeking it, but I can't force you to seek something. So the exile of Moab into the 10th generation, again, the last part, I guess I forgot I'd put this in there and I went back one, so this is just my slide showing the end of that, all thy days forever. And so it wasn't talking about the permanency of the punishment. We're talking about the Moabites now have to seek that entrance. And we're actually going to see some seeking in another part of the story where that will tie together. And so if you dig a little deeper, we're told at the end that they were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah. Well, why were we told they were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah, if Ephrathite means from Bethlehem, Judah? And we were told in the beginning that they were from Bethlehem, Judah. Well, this story was written long after it happened. Ephrathite is not only a word for those from the area of Bethlehem, Judah, it is specifically Israelites from Bethlehem, Judah. It was not uncommon for foreigners to assimilate into the culture of Israel at the time. It was not uncommon for them to live there, even worship God, and then take on Israelite names as well to fully assimilate into that culture. But if you did that and assimilated, you were not granted the same rights as a full-blood Israelite. And so I believe the writer was trying to tell us these were not foreigners assimilated into the culture of Judah. These were Israelites who had the law, had protections that came with the law, but also had punishments that came with the law. And so this also concretes the fact that when two full-blood Israelite men married those Moabite women, they guaranteed them those protections. Because the law stated when you married in, you've got those. And so we kind of get a few echoes and allusions in this part of the story. Famine and death those are common concepts throughout the whole Bible. We see famine all the time, and we see death all the time. And so when we start to look at something that is a common concept through the Bible, we should be thinking of these other stories as we're reading through this one. So when I started reading this story and I found out they were leaving because of a famine, I should have went back and said, oh, there was also a famine in Genesis 12 and 26 and 41. Why are those important? Because important things follow famines. Likewise, I should have did the same thing with the death section of this. So the Bible's set up in a way that we can see the patterns. And so when we see a famine in Ruth, we're supposed to see that without the famine in Genesis 41, Judah would have never been able to redeem himself to Joseph. If you remember your story, Judah was the one that sold him off. Then he went to this whole thing about and all that. Came back, was a changed man, went to buy corn from Joseph, not knowing it was his brother, during a famine. And he would have never been allowed, or he would have never had the opportunity to make right and show Joseph that he was changed without a famine. Likewise, without a famine, Abraham would have not been forced into Egypt, where he would have not gotten a handmaid that was Egyptian to lead to the story of Hagar. It wouldn't have happened without the famine. And so, likewise, if there was no famine in Bethlehem, Elimelech would have never left. The promise would have never been fulfilled for the Moabites, or the punishment would have never been completed for the Moabites without that famine. And then eventually the foundation of the promise for the seed to continue from David would have never happened. And so, what is this telling us? What should we be seeing right here? And I specifically left this next part out of the big picture of the Bible because this is important, and I'm going to bring it up to the end here. What we're seeing is God is faithful to keep His promises. So we read just the first 6 verses of a small book that seems like an inconspicuous story to find out God is faithful to keep His promises. Numbers 23:19, God is not a man that He should lie, neither the Son of Man that He should repent. Hath He said, and how shall He not do it? Or hath He spoken, and shall He not make it good? God does what He says He's going to do. And in Hebrews 10:23, let us hold fast to the profession of our faith without wavering, for He is faithful that promises. God is faithful to us. And so, in breaking down this story the way I did, I don't think I would have ever come to the conclusion that in just the first 6 verses of this story, we have a redemption story. Now, I know the whole book is about redemption of Ruth and the family, but I would never have put 2 and 2 together that it was multiple levels of redemption going on here, showing multiple levels of God's plan coming into play and taking place. More importantly, establishing that pattern of a faithful God so that when we do make it to our new covenant, we can have faith that God is going to do what He said He's going to do, because every other single time He promised to do something, it happened. And there's only one promise left. And so evidence tells us that will happen. These are kind of all the thoughts I have for the first 6 verses. I know it's only been about 20 minutes worth, but the next set of verses is much longer, and I'm not going to tell you how I've broken those down, but I will say it starts with verse 6. I specifically overlapped those verses, but I'm not going to spoil on how I've broken it apart, a little progressive revelation of my own, I guess. But this is just the first 6 verses. Keep that in mind. There's still a whole lot of story to go. There's still a whole lot of details to pull out. And even better, the next parts contain some things that really do prick the heart of a Christian today, because they apply. And I had never realized they did until I started this study. And so in the next part, I did put it up there, I'm sorry. We're going to 22. We're going to see how Ruth's name and Orpah's name fit into the story, because the meanings of those names are going to fit into the actions they play. We're going to notice a few similarities between what happened there, and what happens today. And most importantly, we're going to see a beautiful proclamation of loyalty. And it's actually a verse that is used in weddings quite often, quoted in weddings very often, because it is a promise of companionship given. And so we're going to be able to see that. We're also going to see a few echoes and allusions We're going to see some returning home, which is a popular point in the Bible. God's people leave, they get to return home. And so we're going to see some returning home. And more importantly, we're going to be seeing that we should be seeking aid from the Lord. During our times of need, we shouldn't be relying on our own understanding. We should be seeking on the Lord. More so, we should be leaning on those who are more wise than us, and there's no one more wise than the Lord. And so those are some things we're going to see in the coming parts. Again, this is still a work in progress, so I don't have that part completed yet. I'm still trying to make my notes legible to the mind, I guess, where you can understand them. But you're going to hear a lot of Ruth from me in the coming future. I'm not going to stop until I finish, and I'm satisfied that I have dug every piece of information out of this small book that I can, and I think that's going to take me quite a while. And so those are my plans. So if you get sick of Ruth, I'm sorry, but I'm not really that sorry, because I think that there are things that we can all take from it. But these concludes my thoughts for today. We don't want to close without offering the plan of salvation. I love this picture, and I've used it in several other slideshows because it shows us that it is a stair step, that we have to hear, like the first step of hearing the Bible first. And then we can move on to the next step of believing it, because you can't believe something you haven't heard. And we need to repent, and we need to confess and be baptized. And then we have to stay on this top step and remain faithful until death so that we can have a crown of life. And so I just kind of like this picture because it shows that stair step progression of how that plan is supposed to come into play. And so if you haven't taken these steps and you haven't become a member of the Lord's church, we urge you to do that today. You don't know what's going to happen when we say our final amen and get on that highway. And so if you have not taken those steps, we severely urge you to come today. But if you have taken those steps and you have done something to sever your connection with God, would come forward with the prayers of the church. We can pray with you and for you while we sing the song of invitation.